Hi there everyone, today I'm going to be telling you some basic information about knitting needles, particularly the size and material of the needles. And the needles that I'll be using for this class are the Brittany brand size 6 bamboo needles. They're 4mm. The US, the UK, and Japan all have different number sizes for the needles, but the millimeter size is about the same. In Japan it's 3.9. First, we're going to be going over the different kinds of materials that are used to make knitting needles. Here I've got a few different examples, and we'll actually be going over different styles of needle in the next section. So here we have plastic, metal, and bamboo. Plastic needles are going to be the least expensive needles, and they're pretty widely available. Metal range from more expensive to less expensive depending on the style and origin, and the wood needles are also pretty affordable, but of course there are many different types of wood that people make these needles from. I prefer bamboo or another type of wood needle, mainly because I feel like I lose less stitches because they don't slip off of the ends quite as much as they do when I use metal, but everyone has a different preference for the kind of knitting needle that they prefer. These are fairly inexpensive metal needles, but the more expensive ones have a kind of coating on them that make them more comfortable to hold for a long period of time. I find that my hands kind of sweat when I hold metal needles, so I don't usually use these. And the plastic needles are the least expensive of the bunch, but I don't use them because they don't feel right in my hands. They are really uncomfortable for me in a way that's hard to describe, but they kind of make a scrubby sound when you rub them together and when the yarn slides over them, especially if the yarn has any acrylic content in it. And as I mentioned before, they make knitting needles with different types of wood, and you might prefer a different kind of wood than bamboo. Some of them are a little bit smoother than bamboo. And now I'll be talking about different styles of knitting needle. We have straight needle, double pointed needle, corded needle, and interchangeable needle. And here I have examples of each style of needle. So let's start with the straight needles. These are the stereotypical knitting needles, the ones that you've seen grandmas use in cartoons when they knit scarves. This is a very good style of needle for knitting a scarf or just something small and flat. They come in different lengths because you want to be able to fit the whole project without squishing it on the length of the needle. So just imagine someone knitting. When they're knitting, they're going to be completing more rows of stitching, and that's going to fall on one of the needles, and eventually it's going to be transferred to the other needle. The reason why I don't use these is because the weight is, of course, all on that one needle, so it kind of feels unbalanced to knit with, especially if the item is getting longer and longer. If you can rest it in your lap, it's more comfortable, but I personally don't use these very often, even for something like a scarf. But if you already have these, or if you're just starting out, these might be easier to work with. And next up we have double pointed needles. Don't worry about these too much. I know they look pretty intimidating. They're actually made for knitting in the round. So instead of knitting a rectangle, let's say, you're knitting a cylinder where each needle holds a different number of stitches. And what that does is it makes a circle so that you're just knitting around and around, and you're using one of these 5 needles, and the other 4 have the stitches distributed on them. And here I'm just trying to approximate what that would kind of look like when you had the stitches live on these 4 needles. It does end up looking a little bit like a hashtag or a tic-tac-toe, and this needle would be used to kind of be working on the stitches around and around. So like I said, don't worry about these, just know that they exist. And if you already have a set for some reason, like you tried to pick up knitting before, you can still use these like straight needles, but you're a little bit limited by the length of the project, I guess, but you can still take 2 and use them to knit with just like a straight needle. Moving on to my favorite needles, the corded needle, which is also called the circular needle. And these are not interchangeable, and I'll tell you what that means later. But basically, they're on a specified length of cord. The cord doesn't matter for flat knitting. So if you have a longer project or a wider project, you might want to get a longer cord. But the reason that I have a cord this long is for a long shawl. And if you can imagine the worked stitches that are resting on this, you kind of don't necessarily want them to bunch up on something, which is why, again, there are different lengths of cord. So you can also use this for circular knitting because you can do something called a magic circle, where the cord is kind of coiled within the worked stitches on the project. I personally don't like that method of knitting in the round because it's too fiddly for me, and I feel like I strain my hands a little bit trying to shift the stitches around every time I get to the end of a bunch of stitches. And honestly, don't worry about that a lot. Like I said, we're not going to be covering circular knitting in this class. The most important thing to know about these corded needles or circular needles is that when you're knitting along with them, the worked stitches end up on the cord and the weight is distributed a little more evenly in that case, so that's why I prefer the corded needles even for flat knitting. On that note, I wanted to touch on interchangeable corded needles. So this is the set that I have by a brand called Likey, I believe it is, and these are the Driftwood collection if you're interested. The reason these are cool is because you can take the individual sizes of needle and they come in sets like this one. You can also buy them individually and they just look like regular corded needles, but the cord comes off. And they usually sell the cords in different lengths individually as well. And what you do is you just select the size. They have the sizes printed on the ends of the needle. I couldn't get it to focus, so I'm just gonna put that there, back in there. And what's cool about that is that you don't have to scramble to find the size of needle that you need, and you don't have to slowly build a collection of different lengths of cord for the interchangeable needles. So they just screw in like this. You have a few different lengths of cord that come with each set. You screw the end in here on both ends, like so. They also usually come with a little tightener. There's a hole in the metal part of the cord where you can put a pin in and tighten it up so that they don't come unscrewed while you're knitting with them. And there you have it, a set of corded needles. And these sets range anywhere from about $100 to $150 typically. Of course, there are slightly less and very more expensive ones, but the reason I mention these is so that if you know that you're going to be in this hobby for a long time, or if you've been thinking about getting into different types of knitting projects like sweaters and shawls and things like that, this might end up saving you money in the long run, because I spent a lot of money on needles that I don't use or I don't have to use anymore because I have this set. And I always have the needle that I need in the size that I need. So that's just something that I wanted to mention in case you were ready or thinking about making that kind of investment. They also make these in metal, of course, and Addi, A-D-D-I, is a German company that makes these types of interchangeable needles, and people really like them for the fine quality of their needles. I believe they have a bamboo version as well, but I've just never liked knitting with metal needles, even the nice quality ones, so I don't have that set. But I would advise you to try out different materials before you make that kind of jump, just because I know that I wouldn't have known that I preferred wood if I hadn't tried it. And the metal needles are so popular that I thought a lot about getting the Addi set, and I'm glad that I didn't before I had tried wooden needles. I would always advise working with the material that is most comfortable for you. And as you knit more types of objects, you'll get a feel for what kind of needle suits your knitting style the best and makes you more comfortable in your knitting. So thank you guys so much for surviving the first class of my Learning to Knit with a Witch course. Don't forget to use the hashtag to tag any progress that you have or any hype over the materials that you got for your knitting journey, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye!